My husband noticed my fidgeting as I stood in front of the mirror, constantly adjusting my clothes. "Are you nervous?" he asked, his voice tinged with concern. I couldn't help but keep glancing at the clock, feeling the minutes slip away too quickly. "I am," I admitted, my voice betraying the anxiety that had been steadily building inside me. Today was my first day at a new job, a milestone that filled me with a mix of excitement and dread. I was desperate to make a good first impression on my colleagues and superiors, and the thought of being late was unbearable. I had planned to leave the house well ahead of time, giving myself a comfortable margin to navigate any unexpected delays. But Leroy, always wanting to be helpful, had offered to drive me to work. I agreed, thinking it would be nice to have his company and support on such an important day. Now, however, that decision was beginning to feel like a mistake. We were both at risk of being late, and the cause of our delay was something I could never have anticipated. At the break of dawn, just as the sun was beginning to peek over the horizon, Leroy's mother, Skylar, showed up at our doorstep. Her eyes were red and puffy from crying, and she clutched a few hastily packed belongings as she pleaded with us to let her stay with the children. She was in a state of distress, though she didn't explain why. Her sudden appearance threw our carefully planned morning into chaos. There was no time to delve into the reasons behind her tears or to discuss her request in detail. We had to leave for work, and quickly. So, in a rush, we tried to soothe her, assuring her that she was welcome to stay. We told her to make herself at home, trusting that she would settle in and be fine while we were gone. As we hurried out the door, I felt a pang of guilt for not taking more time to understand what had brought her to our home in such a state. But with the clock ticking, all I could think about was getting to work on time. The day passed in a blur of new faces and tasks, my thoughts frequently drifting back to the morning's events. When Leroy and I finally returned home that evening, tired but relieved to have the first day behind us, we were met with an unexpected and unsettling sight. The house looked different, off in a way I couldn't immediately put my finger on. The first thing that caught my attention was the absence of my beloved slippers. These weren't just any slippers, they were a precious gift from my late grandmother, soft and cozy with a whimsical bear design. They held sentimental value far beyond their practical use. I had always been careful with them, wearing them only at home and never letting anyone else use them. But now, they were gone. As I looked around in confusion, my eyes landed on Skylar. There she was, walking casually around the living room in my bear-shaped slippers, her feet encased in their plush warmth. I felt a surge of irritation mixed with sadness. Those slippers were special, a connection to my grandmother that I cherished deeply. Seeing them on someone else's feet, especially without my permission, felt like a violation of that memory. "Skylar, I thought I gave you the guest slippers," I said, trying to keep my voice light, though it was difficult to mask my disappointment. "Oh, Hannah, yes, you did," Skylar replied without a hint of remorse. "But they were so cold. You young people don't feel the cold the way I do. My feet have been sore lately, and your slippers are just so comfortable. I didn't think you'd mind switching. You can wear the guest ones, can't you? It's not a big deal for you, is it?" Her casual tone and assumption that I wouldn't care stung. In reality, it was a big deal. Those slippers were irreplaceable to me, a tangible piece of my grandmother's love and warmth. But Skylar didn't know that. I hadn't told her, and in that moment, I decided not to. It wasn't worth making a scene over, even if it hurt. I tried to shake off the discomfort as I glanced around the room again, feeling like something else was off. My eyes finally landed on the bare floor, where our fluffy rug used to be. The absence of it created a stark, cold space that made the room feel incomplete. "Where's the carpet?" I asked, my voice tinged with confusion as I looked at the empty spot where it had always been. "Oh, I took it to be cleaned," Skylar said breezily, as if she were doing us a favor. "Forgive me, dear, but there was so much dust in it, as if it hadn't been swept for years. You really need to take better care of it. All that dust can't be good for your health, you don't want to be breathing it in." Her words left me speechless. We had only bought that carpet a few weeks ago, and Leroy and I made sure to vacuum it regularly. There was no way it could have accumulated that much dust. The carpet had been an important part of our home, something we'd chosen together, and now it was gone without even a discussion. The casual way Skylar had dismissed it, as if we were negligent in our housekeeping, was hard to swallow. As I stood there, trying to process everything, I realized that today's events had left me feeling uneasy in my own home, a place that, until now, had always been my sanctuary. Skylar protested, "Well, draw your own conclusions." "Dear, what I mean is that you should have done a more thorough job cleaning," she added, her tone carrying a hint of reproach. I didn't want to get into an argument. I was too exhausted to muster the energy for a fight. My first day at my new job had been filled with new experiences and challenges that left me both mentally and physically drained. All I wanted was to take a quick shower and collapse into bed, hoping for some much-needed rest. But just as I lay down, trying to melt into the comfort of the mattress, my mother-in-law, Skylar, barged into the bedroom without so much as a knock. Her entrance was abrupt and aggressive, her eyes narrowed with irritation as she stared down at me. "Why are you lying down? Who's going to cook supper?" she demanded, her voice sharp and grating. "We already had dinner at a restaurant," I replied, struggling to keep the weariness from seeping into my words. "I'm really tired." Skylar let out a dismissive snort, her expression one of disbelief mixed with disdain. "What kind of dinner is that? Those restaurant meals are so tiny, and half the time you can't even tell what you're eating. This isn't a proper meal. Come on, get up. Let's go cook something decent. Or have you decided to starve your mother-in-law and your husband?" I sighed deeply, feeling the weight of my exhaustion pressing down even harder. But I knew there was no point in resisting her. Reluctantly, I dragged myself out of bed, my body protesting every movement. I followed her to the kitchen, where I found Leroy already hard at work. He had clearly been roped into helping by his domineering mother. He was standing at the counter, peeling potatoes with a resigned expression on his face, his eyes flicking to the television hanging in the corner every few seconds, as if searching for an escape. As the three of us worked together to prepare dinner, my mother-in-law suddenly dropped a bombshell. "I've come to stay for an indefinite period," she announced, her voice tinged with both triumph and defiance. "I had a fight with my husband, and now, to prove my point, I've moved in with my children. I'm not leaving until he apologizes." The words hit me like a ton of bricks. I felt a lump forming in my throat as I realized the implications. Knowing my father-in-law and his stubborn nature, I could see that Skylar was going to be staying with us for a very, very long time. My instincts were right. As the days turned into weeks, it became painfully clear that she had no intention of returning to her own home. My father-in-law, seemingly enjoying his newfound bachelor life, showed no interest in reconciling with her or inviting her back. To make matters worse, it appeared that Skylar was reveling in her new situation. She no longer had to cook, wake up at the crack of dawn, or handle any of the mundane household responsibilities. Instead, she spent her days lounging on the couch, glued to the television, binge-watching Turkish dramas without a care in the world. Occasionally, she would bark orders at us, reminding us of the chores that needed to be done, as if she were the queen of the house. Even Leroy, who usually had an endless well of patience for his mother, started to look at her with an expression that grew more resentful by the day. The tension in the house was thick, and I could feel it pressing down on me, suffocating me with each passing moment. Leroy's face was a mask of strained patience as he tried once again to speak to his mother, Skylar. Each word he uttered was carefully measured, as if he were walking on a tightrope, desperately trying to avoid setting her off. "Mom, please, we've talked about this. Can't you see how much tension this is causing? You need to go back home. This isn't working out." His voice was tinged with the frustration of someone who had already said these words too many times without success. But Skylar, sitting with an air of stubborn resolve, simply crossed her arms and met her son's gaze with a look that was both dismissive and unyielding. "I told you before, Leroy," she said with a firm tone that brooked no argument. "I will leave when your father apologizes to me. Until then, this conversation is over. End of discussion." The finality in her voice was like a door slamming shut, leaving no room for compromise. Leroy's shoulders slumped in defeat as he realized that reasoning with her was a futile endeavor. Seeing no other option, I suggested that we reach out to Leroy's father, hoping that he might be able to talk some sense into her. Leroy reluctantly agreed, and with a heavy sigh, he dialed his father's number. The phone rang several times before Leroy's father finally picked up. There was a moment of awkward silence, as if both father and son were trying to gauge how the conversation would go. "Dad, it's me, Leroy," he began hesitantly. "We need to talk about Mom. She's been here for a month, and things are really tense. Can you please come and take her home?" But the response from the other end of the line was anything but sympathetic. "Are you out of your mind, Leroy?" his father barked, his voice filled with irritation and disbelief. The tone was so harsh that even I, listening from the side, winced. For the first time in so many years, I actually feel alive and free. There's no way I'm taking her back, not now, not ever. Leroy was taken aback by his father's blunt refusal, but before he could say anything, his father continued, his voice growing colder. "She's your mother, Leroy. You should be ashamed for even asking me to take her back. You're a grown man, deal with it." And with that, the line went dead. Leroy stared at his phone in disbelief, his mouth slightly open, as if trying to comprehend what had just happened. A second later, he tried to call back, only to discover that his father had blocked his number, effectively cutting off any further contact. Leroy's face twisted with a mixture of shame and frustration as he tossed the phone onto the couch. He had never felt so helpless and abandoned, not just by his mother, who refused to leave, but now by his father, who had turned his back on them both. This wasn't how things were supposed to be. Marriage was supposed to be a partnership, a safe haven, but now, it felt like everything was falling apart, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. I could see the storm brewing inside him, but I was too angry to offer comfort. I had already warned Leroy that my patience was running out. We were living in my apartment, and the last month had been nothing short of a nightmare. Leroy had lived with his parents before we got married and was still officially registered at their address. Now, with Skylar living under our roof, the atmosphere had become toxic. Leroy knew that if I reached my breaking point, I wouldn't hesitate to kick both him and his mother out. And as much as I hated to admit it, I was getting dangerously close to that point. But Skylar seemed completely oblivious to the tension she was causing. In fact, she acted as though she had every right to impose herself in our lives, as if our home was just an extension of the one she had left behind. Leroy realized just how little she cared about the strain she was putting on our marriage after she had been staying with us for about a month. One evening, we came home from work, exhausted and looking forward to a quiet night. As we entered the hallway, hanging up our coats and slipping off our shoes, Skylar suddenly appeared from her room. Her expression was unreadable as she walked straight past us, not even acknowledging our presence. Leroy and I exchanged a puzzled glance but said nothing, too tired to question her behavior. Skylar moved with a determined purpose, her footsteps echoing through the hallway as she approached the dresser near the front door. I watched in confusion as she pulled open the drawer, rummaging through it with a familiarity that was both unsettling and inappropriate. Then, without a word, she took out my wallet, opened it, and began to remove the cash inside. For a moment, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My mind struggled to process the sheer audacity of her actions. Did she really think she could just take my money like that? My jaw dropped, and I felt a hot surge of anger rising within me. This was beyond anything I could have imagined. "Mom, what do you think you're doing? That's my wallet," I finally managed to say, my voice trembling with barely suppressed fury. Skylar didn't even flinch. She looked up at me with a calm, almost bored expression and replied, "I know it is. But why is there so little money in it?" The way she said it, as if the lack of money was the real issue here, made my blood boil. "That was my first salary," I shot back, my voice growing louder with each word. "Put it back right this second." My patience was hanging by a thread, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep my temper in check. But Skylar remained unfazed. She shrugged, a slight smirk playing on her lips as she tucked the bills into her bra with a casual air that made it clear she had no intention of returning them. "This is my money," she stated, as if that was the end of the conversation. She adjusted her bra with exaggerated care, making sure the money was securely in place. "And what's the big deal anyway? Everything in our family is shared, including money. You should have known that when you got married." She added this last part with a condescending wag of her finger, as if she were lecturing a child who didn't understand the rules. I felt something inside me snap. I couldn't believe the gall of this woman, taking my hard-earned money and then lecturing me about family values as if I were in the wrong. "Well, fine, I'll show you what shared means," I muttered under my breath, my anger seething just below the surface. Without another word, I stormed off to the bathroom, slamming the door behind me. I needed to cool off before I did something I would regret. I refused to come out for dinner, too angry to even look at Leroy. Instead, I went straight to bed, my mind racing with thoughts of how to deal with this situation. I lay awake for hours, formulating a plan. It was clear to me that Skylar needed to be reminded of her place in our home. This was not her house, and Leroy and I were not children to be ordered around. We were adults, with our own lives and our own rules, and she was going to have to learn to respect that, whether she liked it or not. The next morning, I woke up before dawn, driven by a renewed sense of purpose. I was going to show Skylar that she couldn't just waltz into our lives and take over. She needed to understand that she was a guest here, and guests followed the rules of the house. As I quietly got out of bed, I could hear Leroy stirring beside me. He mumbled something in his sleep, but I was too focused on my plan to pay much attention. I moved through the apartment with quiet determination, making sure everything was in place for what I had planned. Leroy woke up a little later and went into the bathroom, where he quickly noticed that something was different. He let out a loud, booming laugh, clearly amused by whatever he had seen. "What's so funny?" he asked, grinning widely. "Keep it down, you'll ruin everything," I snapped at him, trying to maintain the element of surprise. Leroy stifled his laughter but couldn't wipe the smile off his face. Despite his amusement, he understood that this was important to me and did his best to stay out of the way. Meanwhile, Skylar was still fast asleep, completely unaware of what was about to happen. She had grown comfortable in our home, taking advantage of our hospitality without a second thought. But today, she was going to wake up to a very different reality. I was done being the passive observer in my own home. It was time to take control, and I was going to make sure she understood that she couldn't push us around any longer. This was our family, our home, and it was time she learned to respect that. Skylar awoke in an apartment that was a world apart from the home she was used to. The bed beneath her was softer than anything she had ever slept on, enveloping her in a cocoon of comfort. The room itself was a picture of understated luxury, elegant furnishings, soft lighting, and a sense of calm that made her feel like she was in a high-end hotel rather than someone's home. She stretched lazily, feeling the tension in her muscles release as she allowed herself the rare pleasure of lingering in bed. Normally, she would be rushing about, tending to the endless demands of her day, but not today. Today, she had time to relax, time to indulge, and she wasn't going to let it slip away. The children were already at work, leaving her with the entire apartment to herself. There was no reason to hurry. She closed her eyes for a moment, savoring the stillness, the luxury of doing nothing. After a few more minutes, she would get up, have a leisurely breakfast, and perhaps watch an episode of her favorite TV series. The thought brought a smile to her lips as she finally decided to get out of bed. Skylar stretched again as she stood up, her arms reaching high above her head. She could feel the stiffness in her joints begin to ease as she performed a few gentle bends and squats. The air in the room was cool, almost refreshing, and she felt more awake with each passing second. Satisfied with her brief exercise, she left the bedroom and made her way to the kitchen. But as soon as she stepped into the kitchen, she stopped dead in her tracks. Her eyes widened in disbelief as she took in the sight before her. Almost every piece of furniture, every household appliance, was adorned with bright yellow stickers. Each sticker was meticulously placed, and they seemed to cover nearly every surface in the room. Skylar's heart began to race as confusion turned to alarm. What on earth was going on? I was already in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a glass of juice in hand. The scene seemed entirely ordinary to me, but I could see the bewilderment on Skylar's face. "Why aren't you at work?" she asked, her voice laced with confusion and a hint of suspicion. "They allowed me to work from home today," I replied, my tone deliberately calm, as if the sight of yellow stickers everywhere was the most natural thing in the world. Skylar's eyes darted around the room, taking in the absurdity of the situation. She walked over to the refrigerator, where one of the stickers was prominently displayed. Hesitating for just a moment, she reached out, pinched the edge of the sticker between her fingers, and peeled it off. Her eyes scanned the writing on it, and as she read the words, her face drained of color. The confusion in her eyes was quickly replaced by a deep, simmering anger. "What the hell is this supposed to mean?" she demanded, her voice rising as she held the sticker out for me to see. I took my time, stretching my arms and scratching my head as if I hadn't a care in the world. Then, I took another leisurely sip of my juice before responding. "Those," I said, nodding toward the sticker in her hand, "are the prices for services in our house." I took the liberty of calculating everything, down to the last detail, for the three of us, me, Leroy, and you. "Your specific prices are on those stickers," I explained, my tone as cool and collected as ever. Skylar stared at me in disbelief, her eyes wide with shock. "Why is bread so expensive? Are you out of your mind? Taking money from your own mother, especially for something as basic as bread," she shouted, her voice shaking with a mixture of rage and incredulity. I met her gaze without flinching, shrugging my shoulders as if this was all perfectly reasonable. "Well, excuse me," I replied, my voice edged with sarcasm. "You took away my salary, and food doesn't buy itself, just like bills don't pay themselves. Leroy, of course, will take on some of your expenses, as your son, but he can't cover everything. That's where you come in," I said, laying it all out with a firmness that left no room for argument. Skylar's face was a mix of anger and disbelief. "Is Leroy aware of this?" she demanded, her voice trembling with barely contained fury. "Of course he is," I replied smoothly. "In our family, we have a rule, we all pay for everything together. You live with us, so it's only fair that you pay your share," I said, my tone turning steely as I made it clear that this was not up for debate. "The nerve you have!" Skylar exploded. "How dare you? You've turned my son against me. I will never set foot in this house again. You can shove your food where the sun doesn't shine," she screamed, her face red with rage as she reached for another sticker, this time on the coffee maker. But when she tore it off, she found another sticker underneath, detailing the costs for coffee, water, cream, and electricity. "Yes, everything needs to be paid for separately," I remarked dryly, watching her with a hint of a smile playing on my lips. I couldn't help but feel a small, wicked satisfaction as I saw the realization dawn on her. Skylar's face turned an even deeper shade of red, almost as if she were about to explode. Fuming, she stormed out of the kitchen and into her room. For a moment, there was nothing but tense silence in the apartment. Then, her voice rang out, loud and sharp, as she spoke into her phone. "Hello? Have you lost your wife there by any chance? Because it seems to me you have. Come immediately and pick me up, right now. And God forbid you're even a minute late," she barked into the phone, her tone leaving no doubt that she expected immediate compliance. It seemed her husband had forgotten to block her number, and now he was about to face the consequences. When Skylar emerged from the room a few minutes later, she was already dressed, her face set in a mask of fury. She carried her bag with a determined grip and marched over to the kitchen table. Without a word, she threw some money down on the table, her hand trembling with rage. "I'll tell my son everything. He doesn't need such a scheming creature for a wife," she spat, her voice dripping with venom as she turned and stormed out of the apartment. Her husband arrived just 15 minutes later, clearly not wanting to test her patience. As he escorted his furious wife out of the apartment, he paused at the door and turned to me, a look of admiration on his face. "How did you manage that?" he asked, clearly impressed by how I had handled the situation. I couldn't help but smile. "It's all thanks to years of living with my brothers and sisters," I replied with a wink, a hint of pride in my voice. He chuckled, shaking his head in amusement. "Write later and tell me how you pulled this off. I might just give it a try myself," he said with a grin as he closed the door behind them. The apartment, once again, was silent, save for the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. I took a deep breath, savoring the peace that had finally returned. I felt the tension in the room like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. The couple in front of me stood frozen, their faces a mix of shock and confusion. I knew I had to do something to break the unbearable silence that had settled over us. Gathering every ounce of courage, I raised my voice, letting it ring out sharply through the thick air. "Leave. Now." The words came out louder and harsher than I had intended, but there was no taking them back. My heart pounded as I turned my head, searching the room. "Leroy, where are you?" I called out, my voice strained with a mixture of anxiety and anger. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours, with no response, only the oppressive silence surrounding me. Just when I was beginning to think he might have left altogether, I heard a faint shuffling sound from the direction of the bedroom. Leroy appeared in the doorway, moving slowly and almost pathetically. He was on his hands and knees, like a child caught in the middle of something he didn't fully understand. His face was pale, and his eyes avoided mine as he crawled forward, finally standing up with a sheepish grin plastered on his face. "I'm coming, dear," he muttered under his breath, his voice laced with a mixture of embarrassment and fear. As he straightened up, his eyes met mine, and something in his expression changed. A flicker of admiration crossed his features as he took in the scene. "You're really something, Hannah," he said, his voice filled with a kind of awe. "I wouldn't have even thought of handling it like that." There was a grudging respect in his tone, one that made me feel both proud and uneasy. I let out a long, shaky breath, the adrenaline still coursing through my veins. Honestly, the whole situation was a complete mess, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper as I struggled to articulate the storm of emotions swirling inside me. It went way too far, and I know that. But I just couldn't take it anymore. I love your mom, Leroy, I really do. But I can't stand it when she's living with us. It's too much. The words tumbled out of me in a rush, and I felt a knot of guilt tightening in my stomach. Leroy stepped closer, his expression softening as he reached out to touch my shoulder. His hand was warm and reassuring, and I leaned into the comfort it offered. "Don't worry, Hannah," he said gently, his voice calm and steady. "She's a big girl. She'll survive this. She'll calm down, think it over, and maybe even come back to make things right. You'll see." His certainty was comforting, like a lifeline I desperately needed to hold on to. "I really hope so," I sighed, feeling the weight of the day finally begin to lift off my shoulders. But I could still feel the remnants of tension lingering in the air, so I forced a smile, trying to lighten the mood. Leroy must have sensed it too because he suddenly broke into a grin and gave me a playful shove. "Come on," he said, his voice filled with a newfound lightness. "Let's get rid of these ridiculous stickers." We both laughed, the sound filling the room with a sense of relief as we started to peel off the dozens of stickers we had plastered everywhere earlier. They had been a silly, desperate attempt at control, a barrier to keep everything at bay, but now, as we removed them together, I realized they were no longer needed. In that small act, it felt like we were reclaiming our space, bit by bit, and with it, a sense of peace.